Thank you very much. So my name is Sylvain Heiniger. I'm glad to be here because I'm used to be in places where people can speak my last name, but not my first name. Here it's the other way around, so it's nice for a change. I'm gonna talk to you today about NTLM relay. It's a topic I've been studying a bit in the last 3 years, and I didn't have the chance to present it up to this day, so it's good to be here. Who am I? So I'm a security analyst at Compass Security. I do pen testing and some other stuff. And by chance, I started working on Windows a few years ago, and I got interested into this because it's usually misconfigured and it leads to usually quite bad situations. Next to that, I also do some research at Compass, so I get to see lots of the new stuff that's published in the internet. And I sometimes also do red teaming or application testing. In my free time, I like to be outside. I like to not look at screen. I like to be in the forest. I like mushrooms and all kind of nice things you can find outside. If you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter. If Twitter still exists tomorrow, this is my username. So today we're gonna have a quick overview of what is NTLM relay. I'm gonna go about the basics, maybe by a quick show of hands. Who of you is familiar with NTLM relay attacks? So a good half of you know what it is. That's good to know. After talking about the basics, we'll go into the subject of interest here, relating to RPC, so to the Microsoft RPC protocol. And finally, I will try to tell you what you can do after this talk, whether you are a blue teamer, a red teamer, or an responsible for infrastructure. Great, so we'll start about the basics. What is NTLM? What is NTLM relay? How does authentication work in AD? And when I was preparing this presentation, I just typed the title of this slide, and PowerPoint suggests me this nice GIF. And I thought it's just perfect. No, it has nothing to do with what I want to talk about. So let's move to a much more boring slide. So the Active Directory is a place in a Windows environment where you have all the information stored that everybody can access, and it's used for multiple things. But among other things, it's used so that you don't have to log into every single service again and again, be it a website, a file share, or any other kind of Windows service. And for this, we have two main protocols. The one on the top is Kerberos. It's a quite a secure protocol. I think it's been developed at MIT. It's quite good. It's represented with three-headed dogs, which means it's probably secure, right? And the one below is a bit less scary. It's called NTLM, which stands for New Technology LAN Manager. Quite ironic. It's not so new. It should not be used since the 2000 years, but because Microsoft tends to focus on backward compatibility and not on security, we still have it to this day. How does authentication work with NTLM? So you're a user behind this client. You want to connect to a service at this server. So you tell the server, hey, I want to log in. The server generates a challenge, and then it asks you to sign the challenge. Then you do that. You sign this challenge. You send it back, and now the server has to verify if you are you, if your logon is correct. So the server doesn't know your credentials, so he has to ask the domain controller. The domain controller is the system in Active Directory environment which has all this information. So it does exactly that. The server asks the DC if the signed challenge is correct, and if this is the case, then it will return all good, and you'll be able to use the service. And up to this point, the TCP session basically will be authenticated, and you can do whatever you want with this service. Some services implement some further access control, but basically you're authenticated up at this point. This was the layman terms slide, and if you look at the specs, this is actually how it's called. So there are this three-way handshake as a three message name: negotiate, challenge, authenticate, and the part on the right, it's actually over the netlogon protocol, and this function is called netlogon sum logon x. How nice. So what can you do over NTLM, or which protocols are supported? It turns out quite a lot, actually, again, for backward compatibility. So you can visit websites, you can browse shares, etc. You can also browse the Active Directory itself with LDAP, but also maybe a lesser known, you can also connect to mail server with IMAP or SMTP, to database with MS SQL, or to RPC. And probably there are a lot more of protocols that I don't know, or maybe you don't know. Probably there are also quite a lot of proprietary protocol that none of us know. And this is a bit the black box of this, the shadow. And I would also be interested in knowing these protocols. So if you know any more, please get in touch with me. So let's have a basic example. We're going to talk about SMB, so the file sharing protocol, because it's the most common, let's say, in the Windows world. And by default, as I told you, Microsoft usually go for not security. And so the default setting in Microsoft is that digitally signing communication is disabled for clients. It's only enabled if the server agrees. And for server, it's enabled only for domain controllers. So basically, if a client starts talking to a server and wants to access a file share, it's not going to have signing by default. How is it of interest for us as attacker or as pen tester? Well, we are in an internal network and we find a server. We can quickly check if this server is or not vulnerable to this, or has message signing enabled. And if it doesn't, we'll see what we can do. And what we can do is NTLM relaying. Oh, what a surprise. In NTLM relaying, the attacker always stands in the middle between the client and the server. How this is done is actually not the subject of this talk, but it's quite well documented online. I'm going to quickly mention the newest stuff is to coerce a client to authenticate to yourself. So there are quite a lot of tools done to that. But you can actually use any other means that we know, like ARP spoofing, any other classical man in the middle, etc. So let's assume we can be in the middle and the client tries to authenticate to us instead of server, sends the first message. What we do, surprise again, we relay. So we just send this message further to a server of our choice. And the server does its job. It sends the challenge back. We send it back, etc. It gets encrypted. And the third message gets relayed again. You get what happens. At this point, the server tells us, okay, your access is granted. And what do we do as an attacker? We're in the middle. We have now this session with the server, which is authenticated. And what we do, we tell the client, sorry, it didn't work, so that it stops bothering us. And as I mentioned, up to this point, we can abuse the connection. So we have a session with this server over whichever protocol, in this case, SMB, we exploited, and we can do everything in the name of the client. So if it's a simple user, maybe we'll only be able to see some file if there is a file share. But if it has some more privilege, we might be able to edit configuration, execute code, etc., etc. What about session signing? So I told you by default there is no session signing in SMB, but you can activate it. That's a great feature. You should do it. And what happens if there is session signing? The client sends the same message. The server generates the same challenge. Up to this point, the same. But when the client receives the challenge, on top of signing this challenge, it generates a session key. And this session key is based on the challenge and on the client's secret. So basically the password of the user. At this point, it sends the third message normally, and the server asks the domain controller again for the validity of the logon. And here, the domain controller can do exactly the same thing because the server tells him what's the challenge, and the DC has the credential of the user. So that's easy. It generates the same session key, sends it back to the server, and from this point on, the client and the server share a key. This is only going to be used for signing, but it's enough to prevent a relay attack. So as of this point, the client is going to sign the further packet with this session key, which allows him to access the service and allows to authenticate the message. So what happens if we try to do an NTLM relay attack with session signing? Let's keep about the thing we know about. Everything worked up to this point, and now we are at this point where we have this authenticated session. and the client and the server share this secret, but we as an attacker don't have it because we don't know, we know the challenge, but we don't know the user password. So when we try to abuse the connection here, it's not going to work because we cannot sign the message. The server is going to check the signature and it's going to answer, hey, sorry, you're not who you're supposed to be. So that's a great feature. It works, and you should enable it. So this is how you do it. These are the 4 GPOs in Windows, how we can enable this. And this is a good idea to do, but we as an attacker are looking to a way to bypass that. So what do we do if in an infrastructure we find servers where signing is enabled everywhere? Well, solution is easy. We try to relay to other protocols which don't have signing. I already mentioned some other protocols before. Some of them don't support signing, some of them do. So let's start with LDAP and LDAP-S because this is the one that supports signing and has a setting that you can set for it. So you should also do that. And this is easy and then it's done. Then we have HTTP and HTTP-S. HTTP does not support signing and cannot. So this will always be a target of choice for us. HTTPS is a bit of a special case because there is a protection called EPA, Extended Protected Authentication, or something like that. It's also called channel binding. And then we have all the other one, which actually either don't have signing or only in some cases, or it's not well documented, etc. And one of these is MSRPC, and I got interested into that because we were talking with colleagues during a break, and we're seeing quite a lot of connection to our computer in a client environment from a monitoring solution over RPC. And so we got to wonder, is it possible to relay this? Can we use this RPC connection to connect to other people? And as you can guess, the answer is yes, you can do it this way, but you can also relay any kind of connection you receive, be it SMB or HTTP, etc., to RPC, and this is what I'm going to talk about right now. So I'm going to first give you a quick intro to what is RPC, and then I'm going to talk about 2CVE in 2020 and 2021, and finally some new attack paths that I discovered in the past 2 weeks. So MSRPC, this is the slide I have with most text, sorry. It's just definition, it's not so exciting, but basically it's about executing code on another machine that's not yours. We need a solution for that, so there is some standards. The one that we are interested in here is DCE-RPC, which is actually modified by Microsoft in the MSRPC protocol. How does this work on the network layer? In Windows there is a port 135 that's used for that, but RPC can also be called over SMB, so you can also talk to RPC interfaces via SMB over named pipes. And if you connect to the port 135, it's not actually, you're not going to be able to directly talk to the interfaces you're interested in, but you have to ask first nicely to RPC where you can connect to the interface. So I'm talking about interfaces. What are interfaces? These are basically all the possible RPC functionalities that are offered by the server, and you can register as many as you want on the server. And of course, Windows has some typical ones which are going to be available on servers. Then about security of MSRPC. MSRPC is a standard Windows protocol, so it supports the standard security providers. What is of interest of us, of course, is that RPC supports NTLM, so we are happy. And then we have some authentication level, as they are called in RPC. You see that there are quite a lot of them, but basically what interests us is that there is, it's not here, there is one that's called Connect. This one is Connect, which is basically only authentication and no form of relay protection. And then starting with packet, which is actually a synonym for call, we have prevention for relay attacks, so it's going to be secured against NTLM relay. So let's summarize. We have a protocol which supports NTLM. We have no authentication level globally enforced because each interface can actually choose if it wants to have this authentication level or that authentication level. And we have some interesting use cases maybe. So we have to look into these different interfaces to find if they enforce or not signing and if we can exploit them in an NTLM relay attack. So what did I do? I thought, okay, I want to relay to RPC. Where do I start? There are quite a lot of interfaces supported by Microsoft. And but what I wanted to do, or what I want to do as an attacker, is have the most impact. So I looked at the stuff that that makes damage. I started with SAMR, which is the remote SAM protocol, Security Account Manager. This allows you to access credentials on a remote machine or create new accounts, etc. So this is what's used when you do a net.exe on a Windows machine. And basically, I went through the Windows documentation, which is a bit painful, but actually not so bad. And if you go to the documentation, you found out that the server should reject calls that do not use an authentication level of either none or packet privacy. And here you might think, hey, none is interesting, no? But it's actually not. None is only going to be used if it's over SMB namespace, and we don't want to relay to SMB, we want to relay over RPC. So this is of no interest to us. And packet privacy, as you can remember, this is one of the authentication level which provides replay protection, so it's actually not interesting for us. So bad luck, this is not exploitable in a NTLM relay attack, and we are going to have to look further. Another one that might be interesting is the directory replication service protocol. So this one is used for domain controllers to synchronize. It's also known as a desync attack. So if we could exploit that, then we could, if we could relay the authentication of a domain controller, then we can have access to all the credentials of the domains. This would be awesome. So we look at the documentation again. It says DC client must request integrity and encryption. That sounds quite bad. Apparently they thought about that and they request here the highest authentication level. So this doesn't work. I looked at a few other ones, but I'm going to spare you all the documentation. All the way to the COM protocol. This was interesting to me because it's used for remote administration. So if you open a MMC console, for example, on Windows and you connect to a remote server, then it's going to use the COM protocol or the DCOM protocol. So maybe if we can relate to that, we can also do some bad stuff on a remote computer. And here, it's not so clear as the two previous examples. We don't have anything in the documentation that allows you to know if it's or not requiring a secure authentication level. So maybe, and I tried to write a POC for that, but it was a bit complicated because to be able to use the COM interfaces, you need to use a protocol over COM afterwards, and this means over RPC you have to re-authenticate, and so I had to relay twice to the same interface with the same user. It was complicated back in the days, but you'll see that this gets easier after a year. So I went further because this was a bit too complicated for me. I'm also not a developer, so I'm really bad at writing code, so my code was so buggy, I stopped. But I stumbled upon the task scheduler service, the remoting protocol. This allows you to schedule tasks remotely on a Windows machine. So this sounds pretty promising. If you can relate to that and you have the right privileges, you can execute code on the remote machine. And here, the documentation says the client must use an authentication level of packet privacy. So that's bad, right? But it's only the client that must use. So the server doesn't have any requirement. Maybe it's still interesting. So it turns out, otherwise I wouldn't be here. This is exploitable, and the server doesn't have, or didn't have back in the days, a minimum authentication level requirement. So how did that went down? This was back in 2020, but as I said, I didn't have a chance to present until now. I found that in January, I made a small POC using Impacket. I submitted the bug to Microsoft. They were quite quick in reacting and told me they could report this and this would be fixed. And a few weeks after, I got a nice mail that said I would be awarded the bounty. CV got assigned and it got patched after a few months, so this went pretty smoothly. And starting in May, it's not possible to exploit this anymore. So this is pretty good. They fixed this. But I also told them in the bug report that actually there is no global requirement for authentication level. So this is a POC for the task scheduler service, but probably there are more interfaces which are vulnerable to that. And as you can see, what they did in the fix, they just fixed the task scheduler thing. So I was like, maybe this would still be interesting to look into. And actually, I also wrote that in a blog post on our blog, so it was also public for everyone. And so one year later, I had some more time to do research, and I looked into this COM protocol that gave me a headache a year before, and I thought, hey, maybe I can do the same again. Turned out it was a bit easier than the year before, because in between there had been some changes in Impacket, and somebody very clever implemented some kind of functionality to be able to relay multiple times the same authentication from a client. So basically, at the end of the three-way handshake, instead of telling the client, hey, sorry, access denied, you would tell him, please re-authenticate, and there is a special message in SMB for that, and the client would actually do that. So this is cool because it allows you in a NTLM relay attack to not only target one server with one authentication, but multiple server or multiple protocol over the same server, etc., etc. In my case, it was interesting because I had to re-authenticate twice for this, so I could actually use that. And you can do actually the same with the HTTP protocol. At the end of the login phase, you can send a redirect to the user, and this will lead to a second authentication. So this led to a second CVE, but you'll see this is not mine. So I found that in June in 2021, I wrote a POC. It worked. Then I tested it on the Azure lab because I thought it better if I tested it on an up-to-date machine, and it didn't work anymore. So I spent some time looking into this. I looked at all the config that I could have done wrong, but it was really not possible to exploit that. So it turned out it had been fixed. And indeed, there was a CVE in the beginning of June. It was fixed on a patch Tuesday, but the hardening was disabled by default. So it was fixed, but still not fixed for everyone. It was fixed for me on Azure because the Azure VM are hardened by default. So it was I was lucky to be able to find that on an Azure lab. Otherwise, I would have had to do a bug report for nothing. But yeah, up to this point, it was somehow fixed. And then the patch timeline that they decided to go for is that during 1 year, the hardening would be disabled by default. In June this year, the hardening was enabled by default. So if you have an up-to-date Windows server now, it should not be possible to relay to DCOM anymore. But there is still a registry key to disable it. So all the software vendors which did not have time to update their software yet still have a chance to do that. And this is the case until March next year. I also contacted the author of this CVE, and he did a DEF CON talk about this. So if this is of interest to you, you can also go and look into that. So what happens before March 23? Well, if you have a default Windows, I did a small script to be able to check if this integrity was present or not. So it's called DCOM integrity check. It will just try to authenticate using the packet integrity authentication level and then using the connect authentication level. And in a default setup, you will have this message which says, seems like it's configured correctly. If you set this bypass key to 0, then you will be able to connect with the authentication level connect, and this means it might be possible to relay over DCOM until March 2023. This small script is on my GitHub. It's a small gist. Also, I encourage you to modify Impacket. Impacket is so this is based on Impacket. And it's really easy to modify and easy to make such small scripts. Now we're going to come to the newest things, which is a bit more interesting, maybe. And this is the iCert Passage remote protocol. So probably lots of you have heard of the research from SpectreOps on Active Directory certificate services. This made quite a lot of noise, and we actually use that almost weekly to compromise our clients, to help them get better. So this is quite interesting, and it leads usually to quick privask, because if you can forge certificates, then you can quickly impersonate other users. So I looked into the iCert Passage protocol, which is basically the protocol which is used by machines and users to request a new certificate over RPC. And again, I had to dig into the documentation, but if you look in there, you see that there is a flag. It's called enforce encrypt iCert request. And if this flag is set and packet privacy authentication level is not specified, it's really perfect wording in this documentation, then the CA must refuse. So if you take all the negation into account, this means it's exploitable for us. We can do NTLM relay if the enforce encrypt iCert request flag is not set. So that's quite cool. And what can we do if relay to this protocol? Well, we can basically request a certificate for the user we relay, and this allows us to further use his identity to do bad stuff. Now, does this happen in practice that this flag is not set? Well, sadly, it's set by default, or fortunately for you, it's set by default since Windows Server 2012. So this is one of the few cases where Windows is secure by default. That's great. But there is always a but. It prevents Windows XP machines from requesting certificates because it's not backward compatible. And maybe you're going to tell me there is not any Windows XP machines anymore out there. But I guess some of you know there are still Windows XP machines out there, and probably they do also need certificates. So we actually saw this setting at clients where this flag was not set, probably for compatibility reasons, or maybe because the CA server was upgraded from a previous Windows version. So this attack is quite similar to the one that Spectre devised, one of their escalation of privilege attacks. It's called ESC8, when you can NTLM relay to an Active Directory Certificate Services HTTP endpoint. As I mentioned in the beginning, HTTP does not support session signing, so you can do that, and if you can do that, it's the same use case. You can forge a certificate or get a certificate for the user. And my proposal is to devise this new attack, ESC11, because there has been a ESC9 and 10 in the middle. So NTLM relay to ADCS ICPR endpoints. How can you know if this is vulnerable at your company, or if you do pen tests like I do? Well, you can use CertPy. I did a small fork of CertPy, which goes fetch this flag and tells you if it's set or not. This is a great tool by Oliver Liak, which allows you to dump the ADCS configuration. So it will use another protocol over RPC, CSRA, to do that, or the remote registry protocol if it cannot over CSRA, but this is not so important. And it will tell you if the enforced encryption for request is enabled or disabled. If it's disabled, it's going to also tell you, hey, there is an ESC11 vulnerability. And this means you can relay to the CA server over RPC. How would you do that? I also made a fork of NTLM relay X of Impacket to be able to do that. So you can now specify your RPC mode ICPR, and you have to specify here the name of the CA. But this allows you to relay any authentication to ICPR over RPC. So basically, this is a standard NTLM relay attack. So you start your server and you wait until a client connects to you. And as soon as a client connects to you, you will try to authenticate to the CA or RPC. If you're lucky, this works. And then you will get a certificate for this user. I didn't do any fancy videos because I'm afraid of this stuff, but this is the best I can do. So at this point, you have the certificate for the user, and you can use that to connect to all kind of protocols on Windows, or to get his NTLM hash. If you're interested in using this tool, they are also on my GitHub. I also published a blog post today about this, so you can also get all the information there. I will do a pull request for both of these tools. I didn't get to it yet, but I will do that as soon as I get back to the office. So this was basically it about this new attack over RPC. Now, what can you do? So I'm going to quickly talk about what you can do if you're a bad guy and you want to relay NTLM, what you can do if you want to mitigate this or if you want to detect this. So if you're a bad guy, I talked today about these 3 protocols in red that you can probably not read, but that doesn't matter. I also mentioned the few ones in green that maybe you can also not read, but that doesn't matter. But there are quite a lot of protocols in Windows. Not all of them are over RPC, but maybe some of them are subject to NTLM relay. So I really encourage you to go out there and try some protocols, modify in packets. It's fun. And maybe you find something fun. Otherwise, if you want to stay to the classical NTLM relay, I find this diagram from Shutdown repo to be the best. It clearly says how you can coerce NTLM, what you can do depending on what settings you have, to what you can relay, etc. And my plan would be to add the protocols that are missing here, but I also didn't get the chance to do that yet. So if I find the time, I would add here RPC, but also MS SQL, which I find is also an interesting target in NTLM relay. Mitigation, this is going to be boring, but I'm obliged to do that. You have to patch your Windows. It's not very new, but you should do it. Then you should enforce packet signing. So for SMB, LDAP, and channel binding, there are some GPLs you can deploy. It's not so difficult, although there might be side effects, of course. Then 2 kind of best practice could help, least privilege and network segmentation. We had some case in pen test where everything was vulnerable, but because of segmentation it did not work, so this could save your ass. And finally, my last but maybe not the least recommendation, stop using NTLM. So this is an old protocol, I told you. It should be out of the window since 2000, but it's still used. There are good guides online how you can slowly decrease your dependency to this and possibly stop using it altogether. If you're in a blue team, you might want to detect some of these things. So the DCOM relay, Microsoft made a new event for that. So if somebody tries to relay to DCOM and doesn't have the RPC OSINT level packet integrity authentication level, then it's going to raise an alert. So if you ever see that, it means either you have an application which doesn't support the newer authentication level, or somebody is trying to mess with you. Detecting the Active Directory privilege escalation is already quite well documented, but here just as a reminder, you can audit certificate requests, and probably you should. So if you see a request for a domain admin for a new certificate, maybe you should raise an alert, especially if you can correlate this with the logon, and the logon is from another workstation that you don't know, then it should raise all kind of red flags. And finally, NTLM relay is also it's also able to detect that. So in the Windows logon audit, you find always the name of the workstation from where the logon came, and also the source network address. So if these two mismatch, this is a good indicator that somebody is trying to do NTLM relay, or something else in your network is strange. But basically, I'm an advocate for disable NTLM, so you don't have to worry about that. Last but not least, I want to thank everybody that helped in this research. So my colleague at Campus Security, the nice developers of Impacket and Certify, on which on which shoulder I could stand. Everybody that did research in this area. So I put a few names here, but of course some are missing. So sorry if I missed you. Thanks for the nice conference, and thank you for your attention. If you have some questions, I would be happy to answer them. But if you want to go eat, I also understand. It's okay. Awesome. Good, then enjoy your lunch. There is a question.
Sorry, you have to wait a minute. What's the relation between Microsoft RPC and WinRM? Windows Remote Management.
If I'm remembering correctly, WinRM is working over HTTP, so it's actually not using RPC at all. Or HTTPS, if it's well configured.
Hey, thank you. One question I have for you. In the introduction, you noticed you also do red teaming. How much success do you have with NTLM over C2 channels? I know there are some methods with port forwarding and port pendor and such, but maybe you can add something here.
Thank you. So until today, I didn't have to resort to that. So if I can try to avoid doing all kind of weird thing, opening ports and forwarding them, I will do. And usually I go for the low-hanging fruits, and there are quite a lot of them. So I never had to do that. I know it's possible in some cases. Usually you have to, if you want to do NTLM relay from a Windows workstation, you have to be admin on there to be able to bend the ports and do the relaying. So I never really went to all the trouble to do that. But yeah, it's possible. So there is also stuff to do there.
Small question here.
So there was no logo, no name, no website for those vulnerabilities? Is this how you do disclosure in 2022?
So the question is, if I have a logo and a website for the vulnerability? Oh, nah. So I did a nice blog post on our blog. This is all I'm going to do. But I'm going to think about it. If you have logo ideas, just send them to me.
We read sometimes about the future for Quick. Do you think that's going to be a new attack surface?
That's very outside of my comfort zone. I'm not even sure if you can do NTLM over Quick. I hope not. As I mentioned, NTLM is old and Quick is new, so you should not mix that.
Any last question? No? So, please give another round of applause for Sylvain.